Good evening, everybody. I'm Jessica Strand, the Director of Public Programs here at the Library Foundation of Los Angeles. The Allowed series is produced by the Library Foundation of LA, which supports the Los Angeles Public Library. Allowed programs are made possible through member support, so thank you all. But thank you the members in the audience most this evening. If you're not a member, please visit the membership table in the lobby or lfla.org, where you'll learn more about the Library Foundation and our upcoming Stay at Home and Read a Book Ball, a fundraiser that is exactly as it sounds. So I invite you all to cuddle up with a book you've wanted to read and participate. This year, our programs are focused on home. We're not trying to answer the question of what is home, but rather proposing ideas that will make each of us think more deeply about the concept and how it resonates with us. We'll be exploring some topics both obviously and tangentially related to home, like our Constitution, family, food, shelter, our mental health, the natural world, and many others, all pointing in the same direction, to home. This evening, this is my foray into the next thing. Nicholas Kristof and Sheryl WuDunn, both winners of the Pulitzer Prize and authors of many books, including the best-selling Half the Sky. Half the Sky took on oppression of women and girls in the developing world. Now they turn their attention to Kristof's hometown of Yam Hill, Oregon, as well as other rural communities across America to try to better understand, quote, the brittleness of life that befalls 150 million Americans. As blue-collar jobs disappear, 1 in 7 Americans live below the poverty line. Opportunities look bleak as wages remain stagnant, education is limited, healthcare is practically non-existent, despair envelops and overwhelms, leaving an America where 70,000 Americans die annually from drug overdose, 88,000 from alcohol abuse, and 47,000 from suicide. How do we get to this place where so many communities across the country are overlooked and underserved? From Tightrope, quote, a harshness that at times a nastiness has crept into American policy, rooted in the misconception that those who struggle with unemployment, finances, drugs, and life's messiness are fundamentally weak, in danger of dependency, in need of hard lessons, end of quote. Despite this, the stories Kristof and WuDunn tell of the residents are illuminated by flashes of resilience, by providing us with a greater context for their plight, and by giving us such moving portraits. They help restore the dignity that has been stripped from their subjects by their circumstances. I'm honored to introduce tonight's extraordinary speakers. I don't want to take up too much time with their bios. I will say that Nicholas Kristof and Sheryl WuDunn are heroes, waging a war against our ignorance about national and global crises that we might not see so clearly if they weren't here to expose us to the realities that surround us. Nicholas Kristof is an op-ed columnist for the New York Times. Previously, he was a bureau chief in Hong Kong, Beijing, and Tokyo. He has won 2 Pulitzer Prizes, one for columns from Darfur, and the other with his wife and co-author Sheryl WuDunn for their coverage of Tiananmen Square protests of 1989. WuDunn is a business executive, writer, and lecturer. She worked as a business editor and foreign correspondent in Tokyo and Beijing. She now works in finance and consulting. Kristof and WuDunn have co-authored 5 books, including this night's Tightrope, America's Reaching for Hope. Their work individually and together in women's rights, human rights, and global rights have made them 2 of the foremost progressive thinkers working to expose, educate, and often offer thoughtful solutions to problems that are plaguing our world and our society. Tonight, they will be in conversation with Willow Bay. Willow Bay is an author, journalist, and the dean of the USC Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism. Before coming to USC Annenberg School, she was a senior editor and senior strategic advisor at the Huffington Post. Bay was also a reporter and anchor at ABC, NBC, and CNN. As well as being the reporter, television journalist, and educator, she is also the author of Talking to Kids in Tough Times, How to Answer a Child's Question About the World We Live In. Please help me in welcoming Nicholas Kristof, Sheryl WuDunn, and Willow Bay to the stage. Thank you very much.
Well, you have written yet another powerful and deeply moving book in Tightrope. And before I start with the story of that, I thought maybe we would take a look at Tightrope.
One of my most powerful memories from childhood is the number 6 school bus. But this memory is also tinged with sadness. Because today, about a quarter of the kids who rode that bus with me are no longer alive.
Honestly, it just sucks, man. I had everything I wanted in my early 20s. I have nothing now.
We can get prostitutes, we can get drugs. This is no place for a child to be, even an adult.
I mean, I heard he sort of blew himself up making meth,
Yeah. Left a big hole in the world, left in my heart, too.
I'm Nicholas Kristof. My wife, Cheryl, and I have worked together for decades covering some of the greatest injustices of our time.
Nicholas Kristof and Cheryl Wooden. Their coverage won them a Pulitzer Prize.
But we've become increasingly shocked by what's been taking place here in America.
Now, Nick and I are traveling across the country into the heart of communities battling despair.
America is unique when it comes to inequality. We are the richest country on the planet with the worst poverty. That's who we are.
My wife said, "Please call me." That's all she wrote. That text message, I knew my brother was dead.
You're taught that anyone who uses these drugs are evil people. You're not given any indication that these are people who are dealing with health issues.
We're in the worst affordable housing crisis in years, maybe decades.
So 4 families living in a single wide.
Yes.
We want to understand how so many people fell through the cracks and what can be done to change things.
I'm not rich. I have 2 roommates. I don't own my house. I barely own a running car. But there needs to be people that are willing to say, hey, let me help you.
I think it takes a village for someone to succeed. If it wasn't for the support, I don't think I would have just done it.
Whether or not there will be opportunity for everyone, that's the question that we're facing right now as a nation.
So it's time for a new version of the American dream. One that includes everybody.
So, Nick, I want to start with you. You both have covered humanitarian crises all over the world, as we just saw. Yet you wind up unearthing a humanitarian crisis in your hometown. At what point did you realize that Yamhill was in many ways ground zero for this story?
Well, Cheryl and I were going back regularly to Yamhill. My mom is still on the family farm. I obviously have a lot of friends there. And for a long time, we just saw this dysfunction, friends being arrested for drug offenses, families disintegrating, people dying young, and we just didn't know how to process it, Willow. Is this something strange about the number 6 bus? Is it something about Yamhill? I just didn't know, I just didn't understand it. And then we saw the work of 2 Princeton economists, in particular, Angus Deaton and Ann Case, who noted that there are these enormous numbers of deaths of despair across America, deaths from drugs, alcohol, and suicide, enough to lower life expectancy in the US 3 out of 4 years. And then after reading their papers, we saw, you want to understand those deaths of despair. Mm-hmm. That is the number 6 bus. Those are my friends.
And did you know in recent times that the devastation on the number 6 bus, or was it through the journey of reporting this? In other words, had you kept in
no,
touch?
I saw this among my close friends. Yamhill was going was going through this. There was no hiding this.
I wonder if you could describe the Yamhill of your childhood, just to situate us in the journey that place has taken.
I mean, I always think of it as God's country. You know, it's strange talking about Yamhill in the context of people dying early, because it's a place I really deeply love, that I have wonderful, warm memories of, that I always brag about, and I feel a little bit like I'm airing dirty laundry about a place that I care very deeply about. But it's, at that time, it was a population of 540, and it was a farm town. The economy was built around farming, logging, and light manufacturing. The biggest local employer was a glove factory. It is a place that had done extraordinarily well for most of the 20th century. So a lot of families had good blue-collar jobs. The family that got on the school bus right after me was the Knapps, 5 kids. The family had, the dad had a job laying sewer pipe, and the mom drove tractor on a nearby farm. They had been able to buy their own place. When Farland, the oldest kid, turned 16, the family scraped, and they were able to buy him a Ford Mustang, which made me very jealous. And that was true of a lot of the families. It was very blue collar, but at that time, people were able to get good union jobs and really work their way toward a good middle-class existence.
And Cheryl, I'm wondering, did you have trepidation about starting what is a deeply reported journalistic endeavor in Nick's hometown?
I actually was really more surprised at how much we found when we started this journey. So we did know, and I, did meet a lot of his friends, and I knew a lot of the people there, and I sort of knew superficially that they were having problems, that there were people who were on drugs, and oh, that guy smokes, he does meth, and that guy, shoots up, or that guy also deals in drugs. So you hear that, and we never sort of probed much more deeply as to why they did it. And as we were reporting the book, we started finding out so much more, because they really did open their doors, and they let us into their homes, and they started talking to us about their journey. And it was one of the most troubling and sad journeys that I've heard. And they were able to open up much more deeply than the kinds of people we used to talk to when we traveled abroad, when we were reporting abroad, because these people were friends, and they were willing to share a lot of things. And it's the kind of pain and suffering that they went through was just stunning to us.
Nick, before I ask you about how you thought through the responsibility of telling and sharing the stories of people that you grew up with, I wonder if you could
if you can raise kids together, Cheryl and I have 3 kids. If you can raise kids together, a book is a piece of cake. Totally. You put a manuscript down to bed at night, it stays down. A manuscript doesn't play you off each other. If you screw up a manuscript, the stakes of a screw up are lower. They really
much
are.
Lower.
So that, the practice with our other babies helped with these babies. But the process of writing was actually quite easy. I write the subject, Cheryl does the predicates, and then...
That works really well in a library crowd.
That's right.
In Yamhill, we talk about little else but subjects and predicates, actually.
So what kinds of conversations or questions did you wrestle with in approaching your subjects, your friends, to share their personal stories, which they did with an enormous amount of generosity?
This was a lot more painful a book, and just emotionally complicated a book than anything else we'd done, for many reasons. Partly, when you're in Darfur or a refugee camp somewhere, you have this journalistic emotional armor, which you know well, that that protects you from the stories that you're hearing. You're numb to some of this, a professional numbness, if you will. And when you're talking to old friends, you don't have that armor. We also worried a lot about how friends would see what they would think when they read what we wrote. And on the one hand, we didn't want to pull punches. And so we wanted to lay out some of the, the full range of their behaviors, which did involve, in some cases, cooking meth, etc. And I also worried not only what they would think when they read this, but what people like you would think when you read about my friends. There was one person on the screen you saw there was our friend Clayton Knapp, who is this 400-pound guy with gray hair and a big beard. He cooked meth. He died a year ago. I don't want people to look at the pictures of Clayton or to read about him and to confirm some kind of a deeply unfair stereotype about country hicks who screw up. It's the last thing I want. I worry about what people will think about places like Yamhill. I don't want to confirm those. I don't want to confirm prejudices, if you will. And so trying to navigate this journey in terms of writing about people and a place that I care about deeply and explaining some enormous pain and enormous mistakes in this area, but trying also to provide a context and argue that this wasn't just mistakes by people like Clayton, but mistakes by the country in its policies that exacerbated those mistakes, was really complicated. And I think people were willing to tell us.
How did, go ahead, you were about to say something?
No.
Oh, how did you get your subjects past what we know there is so much shame around being poor, around being an addict, frankly, around not succeeding? And how were you able to kind of get people past that in order to be able to share with you the way they did?
I think that a lot of people recognize that, they're in such a bad place. I mean, you saw Daniel McDowell there. He's an Army veteran who basically went to Afghanistan, was, blasted up by a landmine, came back and became addicted to opioids because he was given opioids when he had some, he had some damage to his legs and to his back, and he was being treated with opioids for the pain management, and they just kept ramping up the opioids. And so he lost his great Army job, he lost his wife, he lost his son, he lost his family, and he lost his home. He was kicked out on the streets, and finally this Baltimore station, this organization that was part of this effort by the Obama administration in 2010 to address veteran homelessness, took him in and they gave him treatment. This is what he really needed was treatment. And we were interviewing him, and one of the things he said was, look, you heard him say, I had everything and now I have nothing. And he said, the reason I'm telling my story is that if I can actually prevent someone else, after them listening to my story, prevent them from going down this path, that's how I would feel really grateful. That's how I can give back. So I think there's a little bit of that because people want their story to actually do some good. And they feel that this is a way of contributing to something greater than themselves.
Could you share maybe the story of Amber? Because I think it also helps illustrate your choice of title.
Amber Knapp. So Amber Knapp, Nick talked about Farland, and Farland, this is the story that we start out with in the beginning of Tightrope. This is a family of 5 kids, Farland, who went to school with Nick, and then, Zealand, Nathan, Regina, and Keelan. and they all ended up, 4 of them died. Farland died from, long use of drugs. He actually was one of the meth cookers, along with Clayton, who you saw in the movie. And he was a talented chemist, of course, but actually not a misdirected chemist. And then he died, and then Zealand died when he was basically drunk, passed out drunk, and there was a house fire, and so he died. Regina died of overuse of drugs, from needle use. She died of hepatitis. And then Zealand died when he was basically, cooking meth and blew himself up. And Keelan, the 5th kid, actually survived. He survived because he spent 13 years in the Oregon State Penitentiary. So Amber is the daughter of Farland, and she was this bright young kid, but we actually knew, as she was telling us her story, we actually, she explained that she kind of knew that her childhood was very odd when she was growing up, because in one of the baby pictures she had of the family, they were all happy and smiling, but in the back, you could see a plate of cocaine in the picture. So it wasn't the typical childhood. But she graduated. She was the first kid in the Knapp family to graduate high school, and she got a job. And she loved doing PowerPoint presentations. She actually loved doing Excel spreadsheets and doing all sorts of charts and data analytics. She was really talented at this until she reached the age of 33. Her father, Farland, died. And that just sent her and her sister into a downward spiral. Her younger sister died at the age of 29 from just basically alcoholism. She just started drinking after her dad died. And then Amber started using drugs. She started smoking meth, and she said, "I can't believe that I did this at age 33 because I was so against using drugs." But still, even so, she started drugs. She lost her 3 kids. She lost her husband. She was in jail. And when we met her, she was out of it. She was out of jail, and we thought, she was going to make it. But months later, when we were checking in on her and we texted her to check some facts, we didn't hear back, and we kept texting again. And then her daughter, texted back that Amber's back in jail. So it doesn't always work out, but we still have hope that she will recover, because there are other people in Yem who we have seen in McMinnville who have recovered. You saw Drew in the film. He was the guy at the very end who was walking through the classroom talking to kids. And he's a great example of someone who was in also a very bad situation. We knew his father, Rick Goff, who was worked on the family farm, and Rick also was a longtime drug user and actually died of a disease related to drugs. And then Drew started using drugs when he was age 12, and then his son Ashton started. He was born with drugs in his system, and we thought, oh no, this is being transmitted yet again to the next generation. Well, a year ago, we met Drew, and Drew had been actually in a program that was treating him for drugs. It was called Provoking Hope in McMinnville, Oregon, and he was really in a good place. He was, helping. He was really a leader in this counseling session, and he said he'd been free from drugs for a year. He had taken parenting classes, and he actually was, teaching Ashton, how to read. He was reading to him. He was talking to him. He was hugging him. Hugging is really important. And we thought, oh wow, we really hope that he really hangs in there. In February this month, this is his 2nd year of being drug-free, and we saw him a couple of weeks ago. He had been working as a hotel clerk, and we thought, at one point he told us, it was after like 4 months, he said, "This is the longest time I've ever held one job." So we were thinking, oh my gosh, we hope he keeps it up. And so then, we went back a couple of weeks ago, and he says, "Oh no, I'm no longer at the hotel." And we're thinking, oh my goodness, he lost a job, you can't keep it again. He goes, "I'm now a manager at a moving company, and I have 10 people working for me." And we were at this dinner, and there were other people coming up asking him for jobs. So we thought, wow, this is great. There is hope. People can really recover.
So you do an enormous amount to sort of counter the narrative of poor personal choices with deeply reported data and analysis. And one of the data points that you cite is the declining mortality rate in the United States. Why is that such a pivotal figure?
So, I mean, one of the problems in talking about these issues is that it seems a little weird to be talking about an economic crisis at a time when the economy, macroeconomy, has been doing so well. You know, we refer to a social Great Depression, but this is nothing like the Great Depression of the 1930s when the economy was slumping. And yet, you do have a lot of, the NAPs were going through a Great Depression. And so how do you understand that? What metrics do you use? You can't use output. And life expectancy is a pretty decent metric of well-being of a society. And in the Great Depression, in fact, life expectancy rose by 6 years, even though the economy was slumping. So at this time, even though corporate profits are at a record, the stock market until the last few days was doing brilliantly, life expectancy fell for 3 years in a row before rising a hair in the most recent figure. And that, reflects much of the country. Those who have a college degree and better, life expectancies continue to rise. Those with less than that, which is a traditional gauge of what the working class is, life expectancy has been slumping. And so, and this plays into the issue of poor choices, that it's been driven down, life expectancy has been driven down by these deaths of despair, by drugs, alcohol, and suicide. And clearly, at some level, those reflect bad personal choices. There's no doubt about that. On the other hand, you can predict that a baby born in a certain zip code will have various bad outcomes. They may not graduate from high school. They may end up in prison. They may die early. In Union County, Florida, a baby has a life expectancy that is shorter than in Cambodia or is it Bangladesh. But that is not because that infant in Union County is making poor choices. It's not because that infant is showing lack of personal responsibility. So we argue fundamentally that if we're going to have the conversation about personal responsibility, which is a perfectly legitimate one to have, then we also have to have a conversation about our collective responsibility. And there's an analogy with driving. We all understand that that car accidents, that personal responsibility is a real factor in them. People text when they drive. They drive too fast. They may drive when they're arguing with their kid in the back seat, whatever. And we could say that because that reflects bad choices, we have to teach people consequences. We have to put spikes in dashboards so that when they have an accident, they'll really learn their lesson. No, instead, we as a society understand that civilization is about mitigating the consequences of bad decisions. So instead, we have padded dashboards. We have seatbelts. We have airbags. We've done a million things to try to make driving safer. And yet, in some of these other areas, we still point fingers at the people who've fallen from the tightrope and say, boy, they didn't show any personal responsibility, did they?
So what was the collective responsibility or lack of collective responsibility that we demonstrated that got us here? What are some of the things you discovered?
Well, it really is a result of policy decisions that we made decades ago. This is not something that just happened under the current administration. This is something that started back in the 1970s. So back in the 1970s, between the end of the World War II and the 1970s, we had a really booming economy. The pie was growing bigger, and the slice of the pies, each slice was growing as well. So we had a very inclusive capitalism. By the 1970s, we had a situation where the economy was lagging, and it really needed a kick in the butt. And so we tried all sorts of things. We deregulated, a wave of deregulation. We also moved power from the unions to corporations. We went way too far. We also cut taxes. We cut taxes and we just, cut a little bit too much on the rich. Meanwhile, in the 1970s, things were going differently in a different direction in other parts of Western Europe and in Canada. In the 1970s and 80s, we decided to adopt the war on drugs. That was one of the approaches that we took. We decided to take small bit-time drug users and, oh, they're terrible. They're actually spreading drugs. We got to throw them in jail. And so we had mass incarceration. And this was a policy that probably was one of the worst policy decisions because it left, a legacy of broken families. Because every time you lift up a mostly male, African American male, you put him in jail, you break up a family, and that has causes devastation not just on on the wife, but also on the kid growing up. What's going to happen to that kid? He grows up and he becomes something. Kids growing up without a father figure, they really, especially boys, they really do. It does, hurt their prospects. And so we made these decisions that really did hurt the human capital that we have of America. And meanwhile, as we were throwing, people like Geneva Cooley, who we write about in Tightrope. She was this African-American woman who was, living in New York City, actually living in New York, and she was addicted to drugs. She took a train from New York to Alabama to meet a friend. She happened to be carrying some drugs. She was caught. She had like a bag of heroin and opioids. She was thrown into jail in Alabama, into prison for 999 years without parole. This poor woman, and meanwhile, you have these large pharmaceutical companies. They did invent opioids, which is terrific. I mean, we do need painkillers. It was a marvel, but at the same time, they were over-aggressive in marketing opioids, and they created this new pain index, all sorts of things to actually allow the society to basically proliferate with opioids, and so got far more people addicted and overdose on opioids. And the result is that they have $1 billion in their bank accounts, and poor Geneva Cooley was in jail, and she really didn't harm society in the same way. And so there was this, we just had an imbalance, just a severe imbalance in society. And so these were some of the problems that resulted from some decisions that policy decisions that we took decades ago.
Mm-hmm. And resulted in what you describe in very pointed language as a 21st century feudalism. What do you mean by that?
So, traditional feudalism had a class system and a aristocracy, et cetera, and we were proud in America that we didn't have that. We broke through that. But in fact, upward mobility by most measures is now lower in the US than in the traditional class-conscious countries of Europe. Both absolute mobility and relative mobility has declined. But in many ways, it's now an educational aristocracy. And what matters is not so much the financial capital that you accumulate as the educational capital. The best metrics of child poverty, arguably, and a library is the perfect place to say this, is not the income or wealth of the family. It's how many children's books are in the house. It's how often the child is read to. And there may be some Church Mouse graduate students who are raising that child, but that child has every possible advantage. And this is, there are a lot of, I'd say that in many ways, in many places in Tightrope, we think that the Republican Party has been deeply problematic. But in this educational aristocracy, this is something where I think liberals and conservatives alike have kind of conspired to allow a system of profound inequity. Today, a child going to a poor school is 4 grade levels behind a child going to a rich school. In almost every other advanced country in the world, the country pours extra resources to help disadvantaged students because education is seen as the escalator out of poverty toward a better life, to support the whole country, to build human capital. And instead, in this country, we sentence poor children to a poor future by consigning them to second-rate schools. And then in higher education, we do the same thing with legacy preferences, among others, so that a child from the top 1% is 77 times more likely today to go to an Ivy League school than a child from the bottom 20%. The feudalists of 18th century Europe would be impressed by what we've done.
I mean, it's also, even before you get to college, 1 in 7, 1 in 6 American high school students don't graduate from high school. And, we basically pioneered education. Horace Mann was, someone who basically, helped, establish the idea of mass education. And we were the pioneers there, and we were #1 in the very beginning. That's really what helped usher in sort of the manufacturing, society that we were able to build upon in America. And we no longer are #1. If you look at a lot of the indices that show that look at 148 countries, there's something called the Social Progress Index, and it's a framework developed by 3 Nobel laureates. And in terms of high school graduation rates, we're right in the middle of the pack. In terms of high school attendance, we're number 60 or number 30, depending upon which year you're looking at. I mean, it's really pretty embarrassing. So even high school, we need to have nudges that keep kids in school, and we can do that. In some states, the high schools actually say you have to stay in high school until you're 18, hopefully thinking that by 18 you will graduate, or they say if you want to learn how to drive, if you want to actually get a driver's license, you have to be enrolled in high school, because they know that kids would love to start learning how to drive very early on. So there are a lot of little ways that we actually can keep kids in high school, and that's really important, because basically in this day and age, if you don't have a high school degree, you really can't, have a good job, and you won't be as resilient as you would if you had more education. And if we look at mobility right now, upward mobility in the US, in the 1940s and 1950s, it used to be that basically you could say you'd be making 90% of the people would do better than their parents. You'd be making more than your parents. Then by the 1990s, and this takes a long time. These longitudinal studies take a long time. But by the 1990s, basically, it was 50%. 50% of the people are doing better than their parents, and that's where we are today. It's about 50% of the people are doing better than their parents. That's not really much upward mobility.
So, believe it or not, Cheryl and Nick say they've traveled to 50 states. I verified they didn't do them all together. They did split up a little bit. That they discovered, first of all, that this is not inevitable, but there is an enormous amount of hope. And you argue that America needs a more responsible, compassionate, evidence-based, and accountable approach to governance as part of the way forward. And I wonder if you could just share some of the evidence-based approaches that do leave you with hope.
I mean, this is one of those, we've covered some things like Darfur, sex trafficking, that are really hard issues. In some ways, these issues are ones that we already have proven answers to, because much of the world has already addressed these successfully. Germany, Canada, they also deal with automation and globalization, and they don't have life expectancy falling. Many parts of the US have engineered really impressive solutions. Solutions is kind of a grand word, but ways of improving a problem. In Oklahoma, there's a fantastic drug treatment program called Women in Recovery that lasts 18 months, so it's much more intensive than others. but it only has a 4% recidivism rate after 3 years. And it's the most joyous place imaginable to see this. It saved Oklahoma $70 million in reduced incarceration costs. Or if you maybe especially in LA, homelessness seems like just about the most intractable, obdurate problem one could have. It often mixes issues of addiction, which are incredibly challenging, and issues of homelessness as such, and issues of affordable housing, which have their own layer of complication. And obviously there's no silver bullet to solve the housing problems. But when we as a country were embarrassed by veteran homelessness in the Obama administration, as there were more and more reports about veterans coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan after having risked their lives and being out on the street, we as a country were embarrassed by that. We found this intolerable. And so in 2010, the Obama administration introduced a major effort to reduce veteran homelessness. There was no magic about their responses, and they addressed the addiction side and the housing side. And the upshot was, over 6 years, we reduced veteran homelessness in the US by half. Well, if we were sufficiently embarrassed by child homelessness in the US, we wouldn't solve that, but I bet we could reduce that by half as well. If we were sufficiently shocked by so many of these other problems, we could make real headway in these. And I think what we've often found frustrating is that there are these particular programs that deeply impress us, that we visit. We write an amazing program in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, an after-school program for at-risk African-American kids, or this Oklahoma program for women in recovery, or this and that, and often financed by philanthropy. And these are truly incredible and amazing. We've seen them transform lives. And we would never try to build an interstate highway system in America with volunteers and philanthropy. And in the same way, when we lose more Americans every 2 weeks from drugs, alcohol, and suicide than we lost in 19 years of war in Afghanistan and Iraq, then maybe it's time for a similar major effort to try to address some of these problems in a more systematic way, borrowing from the lessons of so many other communities within the US and abroad.
And Cheryl, when you look at this set of problems with your lens as somebody with a business background, an economic background, and a finance background, are there certain areas that you think are the critical ones to tackle first?
No, I do think that the whole model of capitalism, I do think, has to be re-examined. And as I mentioned earlier about the capitalism, the inclusive capitalism between the end of the World War II to the 1970s, it really was more of a stakeholder capitalism. We had, a lot more people sharing in the gains. And then we overshot when we took, power away from the labor unions. They did have too much power perhaps at that time, and it needed to shift a little bit, but we've overshot right now. And so now our shareholder capitalism is just gone too far. And, shareholder capitalism was something that was popularized by Milton Friedman. So it's not as though it is an inevitable kind of capitalism. It is something that actually, was, proselytized, by the Chicago Business School or economics department there. We actually can re-examine that and think about going back more towards stakeholder capitalism. And there is a little bit of a movement. There are signs that people are interested in it. So Jamie Dimon, for instance, at JP Morgan has been the head of a business council that is trying to get more leaders to look at talking about the importance of stakeholder capitalism. They've signed this document. We'll see if that actually gets implemented, that people actually really do try and look more towards stakeholder capitalism. But it is something that is very important because, labor is very important. There are people who, in other countries, labor actually, has seats on the board of directors, and they find it very valuable because they get insight into actually what people on the front lines, the workers, are actually thinking, and that's actually very useful for a company. So I think there are many things that we do need to start thinking seriously about, and I think the whole idea of stakeholder capitalism is one of them.
Maybe we'll go to the audience for some questions. You feel like taking some audience questions?
Great.
Sure.
Fantastic. All right.
Easy questions to me, hard ones to Cheryl. Our division of labor.
Great. There are people coming around with mics, so we'll let them land. Okay.
Hi, Nick and Cheryl. Terrence McNally. Nice to see you. In your book, one thing that I've missed so far in this talk is what I see is the interrelationship of narrative, policy, and racism.
And what?
Racism.
And how the narrative that was carved out for a racist America now is biting white America. Could you talk a bit about that?
Sure. So, I mean, it's Yamhill is basically lily white. And so in the 1990s and 2000s, there was a lot of harsh commentary in places like Yamhill, and I think a lot of white communities around the country, about how the struggles in African American communities were the consequences of what was called black culture, and deadbeat dads, and bad choices, and irresponsible behavior. And meanwhile, the great Harvard sociologist, William Julius Wilson, said, no, it's about jobs. It's about jobs leaving. And he was exactly right, because when jobs left Yamhill, and when they left Maine, when they left Appalachia, the same patterns unfolded. And in a larger sense, I think one of the reasons we ended up today in this mess is that in 1968, President Nixon launched the Southern Strategy, and you had a long-term approach of essentially racializing issues of investment in human capital and benefit programs, stigmatizing these programs. They will benefit the other. And the upshot was that we substantially underinvested in human capital in this country compared to our peer countries. Now, at this time, there is new thinking about these issues. And we see the framing of often changing from junkies to people in need of treatment. Now, African Americans look at this and think this is absolutely hypocritical, incredible double standard, and they are completely right. I mean, there is no doubt about that suddenly, journalists are humanizing these problems, and policymakers are expressing concern, and how do we get more naloxone around to prevent overdose deaths? Absolutely, this is a double standard. Absolutely. But perhaps one consequence of this hypocrisy can be belatedly more intelligent and compassionate and evidence-based approaches to finally, belatedly, address some of these underlying issues. And I have just a whisker of hope that as a country we may be able to finally resume some investments in human capital as it becomes harder to racialize these issues. For 50 years, America essentially was engaged in a long project to cut taxes and underinvest in human capital as a result. And that kind of reached its apex in Kansas a few years ago under Governor Sam Brownback. You may remember that. And Kansas schools then got so bad that Kansas Republicans stood up and said, tax us more. Tax us more. We want better schools. And I wonder if historians may not look back and see that as some kind of a turning point when this long experiment in slashing investment in American human capital finally cut so deep that may indeed have been a turning point. Utah and Idaho both expanding Medicaid may be part of that turning point as well. I hope we may get better policies as a consequence.
Hi, I was just wondering that since the book came out, did your friends in Yamhill read it, and how have they responded so far?
No, actually, we've been very glad that they've responded very well. We actually flew someone out from, Irene Green. We flew her out actually to New York City to be on a panel, and she was, great on the panel. We were a little bit worried that she'd never been out. She'd never been to New York, never been outside of Oregon, but she actually did beautifully. And there was one situation where we got a note after one of the people in the book read the story about Mike Stepp. I don't know if any, if you remember Mike Stepp. He's actually someone who was on the bus with Nick. He got on the bus right after him. They walked to school often together. And Mike is now homeless, and so we had written up his story, and he is a great storyteller. I mean, he told us about how he, had done really well in the military. He got a Purple Heart. He financed his school, his children going to college, and so we wrote all of that. But then we also, talked to his wife. And so the way we tell it is that it's kind of a Rashomon. So we tell, Mike's story, and then a few pages later, we tell Stephanie's story, where she says everything was crap, it was wrong. So Stephanie had read Mike's version and, almost flipped out. She sent a note saying, "Oh my God, you got it all wrong. My daughter's so upset because she put herself through college, and you said that Mike paid, and he didn't pay it at all. This is so upsetting. How can you do that?" And then we had to explain, "Can you read a little bit further on in the paragraph?" And she did, and she was just delighted. It really was exactly. We felt very relieved because we weren't sure if that was really the problem, but it was. So far we've been glad of the response. But what's funny, we also are getting responses from other people around the country, friends of ours who are saying, "Oh my gosh, this is just like what's happening, in my hometown in East Tennessee," or "This is what's happening in upstate New York. This is what's happening in Maine. This is what's happening in Montana." So there is a lot of things that are going on in Yamhill that are echoing across the country.
I actually just got a text today from somebody in Farland Knapp's family to say that they'd read that because of the book, because of Tightrope, there had been a bunch of contributions to the drug treatment program called Provoking Hope in the area, and that they thought that Farland would be really happy that, that was partly because of telling his story, that other people would be able to get the treatment that he and his siblings had not been able to get. And I think that for the Knapps and the Greens and so many others that we write about, it's painful to have their most humiliating moments broadcast to the world, but at the end of the day, they don't want your sympathy. What they want is dignity, respect, and if their problems can be leveraged to provide some help for others, then that does give them that sense of respect and dignity. And so it has been really gratifying to see them respond in that way.
Thank you so much for this work that you've done and all the previous work. What I can't help thinking about is these people who held these labor jobs, blue-collar jobs that are so much disappearing in our automated world, our increasingly automated world, AI, all of that. Where are the opportunities? Are you taking that up in the book in terms of where can we employ people who are undereducated or come from these pasts that once they're rehabilitated and we get them secure housing and so on?
So there's two parts to that question. One is the current people in transition, and the second part implied is the next generation. So when it comes to this current generation, the people who are in the transition, one interesting comparison is what happens in other countries. So at the end of the financial crisis, we had a really good opportunity to see what happened when the automakers actually laid off people in Detroit and also in Windsor, Ontario, Canada. And in Detroit, and often it was the same automaker. So in Detroit, basically, people were laid off, but they also got a little bit more of unemployment benefits because of the unusual circumstances. But they got laid off and they lost their health care because that came with the job. And so that really put a huge stress on them and on the rest of their family. Over in Windsor, Canada, what happened was that they lost their job, but Canada has universal health care, so they kept their health care, so that took away a huge stressor from the family. And then also the government kicked in and looked around the area for where there was a demand for jobs, and they discovered nursing had a demand. Okay, so you're taking auto workers and you're thinking about nursing. Well, what they did that. They actually created training programs for these auto workers to actually learn something about the nursing field because that was where their jobs were. And the result is that a lot of these auto workers got reintegrated back into the workforce much earlier on. And years later, they're not, mired in self-medication or in loneliness or in depression, which is what happened here in the US. So there are other models. Retraining is something we do not do very well in the United States. We actually think, oh my gosh, 2 weeks retraining. They don't even connect with other employers in the area to find out what kind of skills the employers need. It's just, here's a retraining program. We need to take it much more seriously because in Europe and Germany, they do it very well. And in Canada, they also do it very well. So in terms of how do you build resiliency so that people can actually do a lot of this on their own, that's where the education comes in. So for the next generation, we need to start thinking about how do we train people who may not necessarily want to go to college, or not everybody's destined for college. So if we can get those, 1 in 7, 1 in 6 Americans who don't graduate from high school, we can get them into sort of a kind of vocational, modern version of a vocational training in high school. That would at least help them, get employed in the modern sort of low-tech jobs, of which there are quite a bit in the U.S. Oh, she gets around.
In the last few months, I think we've all been kind of talked to death with the Democratic debates. And obviously this evening we realized that none of these people who are up for nomination to be the next Democratic nominee have approached this subject, which you must find disheartening. But as you mentioned, in Canada, there was kind of this universal health care that really helped all these workers that were laid off. So I don't want to put you in a position of really picking one of these Democrats that you think would be the best nominee, but several of them are purporting a Medicare for all situation similar to, let's say, Canada. Do you think that that would be a really important way for the United States to go in helping some of these problems? And maybe if there was a, drug treatment program included in Medicare for all? How are you feeling about that?
So, I would push back at the idea that the candidates haven't addressed these issues. I think, in fact, that, across the board, many of the candidates do support programs that would make a real difference. No silver bullets, but if you pardon a farm boy expression, there is silver buckshot. And so, I find the debate among the candidates about Medicare for all, I find that somewhat unnecessary, because it seems to me that what matters is that there be universal coverage. And it doesn't matter whether it's a single-payer system like Britain or a multi-payer system like Germany. What matters is the universality, and also that it covers dental and not just medical. 74 million Americans don't have dental insurance. That's so on, as long as, so across the board, the Democrats certainly would try to address health gaps to some degree, some more aggressively than others. The early childhood piece is one that several of the candidates have addressed, and that has been relatively uncontroversial in ways that I find impressive. It's often been presented as a child care program. And indeed, if there were a national pre-K program, high-quality pre-K program, that would be enormously advantageous for parents, especially single parents, who want to work. This would be terrific for them. It would also be fantastic for kids from disadvantaged households to get high-quality socialization and pre-K. There are few things that would have as high a return as that kind of early childhood program, and it's not actually enormously expensive in the range of various programs that we could have.
We have a final question right over here.
Hi. First, where is Yamhill in location to a big city or something like that? And second would be, can you walk us through when you leave Yamhill and then you go and maybe through the decades, 80s, 90s, aughts, and so forth, how do you experience the social and economic disruption as a visitor back there?
So Yamhill is southwest of Portland. It's at the very edge of the Willamette Valley as it goes into the coastal range. So it's the town of Yamhill is actually half in the coastal range and half in the Willamette Valley. The Highway 47, which is the division, it cuts right through town. And so, my mom is still on the family farm. We go back, and we were foreign correspondents in Asia for much of the 80s and 90s. My best friend back in Yamhill is a local dairy farmer, and I remember at some point we noted that we were no longer talking about our classmates who had been arrested, and now we were talking about our classmates who had died. And that was very sobering. And then there was about 10 years ago, there was a girl, a schoolmate who had been, I remember, as this she was a cheerleader. She was from a deeply respected family in town, and I'd lost touch with her, and then she froze to death while homeless. And Stacy Mitchell, and trying to understand how a close-knit community where I would brag about how everybody knew each other, we all looked out for each other, how Stacy Mitchell could freeze to death while homeless. That was a kind of a horrible moment for me, and I think for a lot of our friends. And look, there are a lot of people in Yamhill who've been doing great. Wineries have moved in. You may well have drunk some Pinot Noir from Yamhill. And people go and have weddings in Yamhill, and a lot of the town is doing fine. And Stacy Mitchell freezes to death. And I guess, and she had been, I didn't know that, but it turned out she had been wrestling with alcohol and meth for many years prior to that. But that for me was just a huge wake-up call that something was profoundly wrong.
Nick and Cheryl, thank you for this extraordinary book and this extraordinary evening. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Nicely done.